Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Please subscribe or my channel. The air left my lungs so fast my ribs hurt. 1 second I was standing at the front of the 12th floor executive conference room with my clicker in one hand and a glass wall full of rain-streaked Manhattan behind me, and the next, Sloane Whitaker rose from her leather chair, smoothed the sleeve of her cream silk blazer, and cut across my presentation like a blade. The fluorescent recessed lighting hit the polished walnut table so hard it looked wet. 22 printed market forecasts sat fanned out in front of the board members, glossy and precise, each one carrying my name in the footer. Sloane placed 2 manicured fingertips on the stack nearest her as if she owned the paper, then looked at me with the kind of smile that never touched the eyes. "We don't need your ideas anymore," she said. The room changed shape around that sentence. Her father, Gerald Whitaker, the CEO of Whitaker Consumer Group, leaned back slowly in his high-backed leather chair and folded his hands over his tie like he was settling in for entertainment. Martin Kessler from Finance stopped mid-note, pen hovering over yellow legal paper. Priya Sethi from Brand Strategy lowered her eyes to the table and went perfectly still. Owen Pike, Sloane's boyfriend and recently invented Executive Vice President of Innovation, gave a small cough into his fist and shifted his weight with the confidence of a man who thought the fall had already happened and just hadn't reached the floor yet. Then Sloane picked up a black folder from beside her laptop and slid it across the walnut toward Gerald. "I think," she said, her voice bright and almost bored, "before we hear any more from Noah, the board should know he's been shopping our internal strategy deck to outside buyers." The silence that followed was absolute. I watched Gerald open the folder, watched him pull out color printouts. My deck, or what looked like my deck. Slides, email screenshots, a contact list, a payment spreadsheet with my name at the top in bold. Across from me, board member Helen Brock adjusted the tortoiseshell frames on her nose and stared down at the pages with her mouth slightly open. Malcolm Reyes, general counsel, pressed his thumb hard against the table edge and looked at me the way people look at smoke under a closed door. Sloane stayed standing, chin lifted, one hand on the chair back, heels planted on the gray carpet like a metronome. "My name is Noah Avery. I'm 34, and this is the story of how I walked into a room where they planned to bury me and left with their company, their lies, and every last illusion they thought money could protect." Gerald didn't look up right away. That was his favorite tactic, make people sweat in the pause. Make them feel small enough to confess to anything just to break it. When he finally raised his head, his expression was grave in that rehearsed, paternal way executives use when they're about to ruin someone politely. "Is there something you'd like to explain," he asked, "before I call security?" Owen let out a faint laugh and leaned back, ankle over knee, trying for relaxed. But his hand was gripping the chair arm hard enough for the knuckles to blanch. Priya swallowed and shifted a glance toward me. Martin's pen resumed moving, quick and nervous, scratching across the page like an insect in a glass. Sloane tilted her head. "Actually, let's make this simple. Noah, did you or did you not send proprietary growth projections to Redwood Retail Partners last Tuesday at 11:42 p.m.? Her voice carried, crisp, designed for witnesses. I could smell the room now. Expensive coffee gone lukewarm, printer toner, the faint, clean sting of furniture polish. Rain ticked softly against the windows. The city beyond them looked pale and metallic. "No," I said. She gave a short, delighted little exhale, the kind people make when the trap closes exactly as planned. "Then you're saying these are fabricated?" "I'm saying," I replied evenly, "that you should let me finish my presentation." That got a reaction. Malcolm's brows pulled together. Gerald sat forward. Sloane blinked once, thrown not by what I said but by what I didn't do. I didn't lunge for the papers. I didn't demand to see them. I didn't raise my voice. I just set the clicker down beside my water glass, uncapped a blue felt tip marker, and turned to the whiteboard behind me. "You're in no position to," Sloane started. I wrote one date in large, clean numbers. March 14th. Then I drew a line beneath it and added 3 words. Server access logs. Nobody spoke. Gerald's jaw tightened first. Just a fraction. Owen uncrossed his leg. Priya lifted her eyes. Martin stopped writing again. I capped the marker, placed it very carefully on the tray, and turned back to the room. "If you'd like to call security," I said calmly, "do it now. If not, you should all sit down and listen." Sloane stared at me as if I had answered in a language she didn't speak. And that was the moment the temperature of the room changed. Not enough for them to admit it, just enough for them to feel it. They thought they had interrupted my pitch. What they had actually interrupted was my timing. 3 months earlier, Gerald Whitaker had pulled me out of a mid-level strategy role at a private equity-backed logistics firm and brought me into Whitaker Consumer Group with the kind of offer people are supposed to feel grateful for. Base salary above market, equity promise, direct visibility to the board. He'd said, "We need someone who sees around corners." What he meant was they needed someone willing to clean up the mess left by Owen Pike, who had somehow failed upward through 2 divisions and now carried a title that sounded made in a hurry. Sloane introduced herself on my first day by looking at my resume for less than 2 seconds and saying, "Dad likes saviors. Try not to enjoy it too much." She wore confidence the way some people wear cologne. Too much of it, and always to announce arrival. She was 31, sharp-featured, glossy-haired, and permanently positioned half an inch too close to everyone else's space. In meetings, she never sat back. She leaned in, elbows on the table, fingertips pressed together. It made people feel interrogated even when she was smiling. Owen was different. Softer voice, softer frame. The kind of handsome that had no weight to it. Tailored suits, expensive watches, an expression of mild amusement he mistook for authority. But there was panic underneath him. I saw it by week 2. Every time numbers got specific, his eyes flicked left. Every time someone asked for implementation details, he deferred to the team. He was decorative, and everyone except Gerald knew it. My job, at least on paper, was to rebuild Whitaker's declining home division. In reality, I was there because the company was bleeding margin, their direct-to-consumer expansion was misfiring, and they needed a credible plan before an aggressive financing round. I built that plan. I did it the old-fashioned way. Store visits in Jersey and Connecticut, customer interviews, SKU-level audits, margin analysis, fulfillment bottleneck mapping, 12-hour Saturdays with stale sandwiches on a conference table and a junior analyst asleep against a pile of cartons in a Queens distribution center. I found the problem in less than 2 weeks. The company wasn't failing because the market had shifted. It was failing because someone was siphoning decision-making into vanity projects and hiding the losses under reallocation language. I first saw Owen's fingerprints on a Monday night in the 8th floor analytics room, where the carpet always smelled faintly of dust and overheating plastic. It was after 10. Most of the offices were dark except for a strip of amber lamplight from Priya's workspace down the hall. I was running a variance comparison between approved innovation spending and actual vendor disbursements when a cluster of payments stood out. Same consulting vendor. 3 different budget buckets. Same bank suffix. Slightly altered scopes. Brand immersion. Consumer resonance workshop. Premium shelf architecture sprint. Total build in 90 days. $2.8 million. Total deliverables produced. A 16-page trend mood board and a video sizzle reel, so empty it felt insulting. I printed the ledger, laid it beside the vendor contracts, and followed the signatures. Every approval chain ended with Owen. Every exception note cited urgency. And every urgency memo had been copied to Sloane. The next morning, I brought a narrowed version of the issue to Gerald. Not an accusation, just a financial concern. He stood beside the floor-to-ceiling glass in his office with one hand in his pocket and the skyline behind him. The room smelled like cedar and coffee and money old enough to think itself moral. He skimmed the summary once. "You're here to build," he said without turning fully toward me. "Not to get distracted by administrative noise. 2.8 million isn't noise." He gave me a patient smile. "At this level, Noah, everything is a matter of timing." That was the first moment I understood the culture at Whitaker correctly. Not inefficient, not chaotic, protected. After that, I stopped bringing concerns upward. I started collecting them sideways. I never hacked anything. I never stole anything. I just watched carefully and remembered that arrogant people create patterns. Sloane used the same assistant for calendar shifts, same driver on late nights, same private dining room at Barlow on West 57th when she wanted conversations off-record but not too far from Midtown. Owen reused passwords with minor emotional tweaks. Gerald never put anything explicit in email, but he loved voice notes sent through a secure app because he thought audio vanished more cleanly than text. He was wrong. The trick wasn't catching them doing one bad thing. The trick was understanding the architecture of their confidence. That's where people keep the real evidence. Not in secrets. In habits. I got my first break from someone nobody in that building ever looked at twice. Camila Torres worked in executive support and had a way of moving through chaos with a legal pad hugged to her ribs and an unreadable face. She was the one who booked Sloane's dinners, rescheduled Gerald's investor calls, remembered whose spouse hated which charity gala, and knew where everybody was buried because she handled the calendar for the people holding the shovel. We spoke occasionally because I treated her like she existed, which in that building apparently counted as radical. One night around 9:30, we ended up alone in the break room on 11. Matte gray cabinets, harsh under-cabinet lighting, a refrigerator humming too loud in the corner. She was stirring powdered creamer into coffee she clearly didn't want. I was microwaving soup that tasted like salted cardboard. Without looking at me, she said, "If you're smart, you'll keep backups of every file you present from now on." I looked at her. "Why?" She blew across the coffee. "Because people around here don't steal what they can create. They steal what already works." Then she took her mug and walked out. I didn't ask follow-up questions. You don't when someone risks that much in that tone. You just listen. So I backed up everything. Every draft. Every access log. Every version history. I started presenting with clean copies and keeping forensic originals offline. I bought a second encrypted drive and left it in a safe deposit box on Lexington. I duplicated the market plan. I documented who requested access. I kept a dated notebook. Old school. Hardbound. Black cover. No cloud. No sync. Ink on paper. 2 weeks after Camila's warning, Priya asked if I could stay late to review brand migration decks. We sat in one of the small internal rooms with frosted glass walls and a scuffed oak table between us. It was almost midnight. Her eyeliner had smudged slightly at the corners, and she kept rotating her wedding band with her thumb. A sure sign she was debating whether to say something she shouldn't. "You should know," she said quietly. "Sloane's been circulating a version of your omni-channel plan as if it came from Owen's team." I let that sit between us. "How long?" 10 days. Maybe more." "Why tell me now?" Priya looked down at the printed slides. "Because I've spent 6 years in this company watching talented people get used like scaffolding and then blamed when the building tilts. And because your plan is the first thing I've seen here in 2 years that could actually work." I nodded once. "Do you have proof?" She met my eyes then. "If I did, and if I sent it, and if anyone asked," I never had this conversation. That night, at 12:17 a.m., a file appeared in a dead-drop folder I'd created for secure vendor exchange. No message. No note. Just a zip archive. Inside were internal review PDFs with tracked comments disabled but metadata intact. Author tags showed Owen's chief of staff exporting my slides from a restricted subfolder. Comments from Sloane included things like, "Make this less Noah," and "Dad will only buy it if Owen owns the room." I stared at the screen for a long time in the blue glow of my apartment kitchen while traffic hissed 12 floors below. Then I made coffee I didn't need and started planning. By the time Sloane stood up in that conference room and accused me of selling company secrets, I had already spent 6 weeks arranging the fall of every person smiling at me. That's why I didn't flinch when Gerald pushed the folder toward Malcolm. "That's enough," Malcolm said. "Noah, I strongly suggest you answer the allegation directly." "Of course," I said. I reached for my iPad, unlocked it, and turned it around so the room could see. Not rushing. Just a few taps. The screen glowed white and blue against the dark table. First, the email screenshot in your folder. The message to Redwood Retail Partners. You'll notice the sender address is mine. Look closer at the domain. Sloane's eyes narrowed. "It's misspelled," I said. "A replaced vowel. Registered 9 days ago through a shell privacy service in Delaware." I have the registrar response, the purchase timestamp, and the IP range used to access it. Owen shifted in his seat. "That proves nothing." "Second," I continued, scrolling slowly, "the attached deck in that email contains 12 slides from a version that was never approved for external review because slide 13 included a deliberately false margin sensitivity curve. The error is tiny, 3 basis points in the Southeast Regional Freight Model. I inserted it after I noticed my materials were being copied. I looked at Gerald then, not Sloane. No legitimate recipient would have that version, unless it was taken from an internal, unauthorized export. Helen Brock pulled her copy closer. Martin leaned in so hard his tie brushed the table. Malcolm extended his hand without speaking, and I passed the iPad to him. Sloane laughed once, too high. So your defense is that you sabotaged your own work. My defense, I said calmly, is that someone used stolen material badly. That was the first revelation. I gave them 3 more before anyone recovered. The payment spreadsheet in that folder, I said, tapping a second file, shows a transfer to me from a consulting intermediary. That intermediary is controlled by Pike Advisory Ventures, LLC, which is interesting because that entity's registered address is the same address Owen used for his former design shell in Brooklyn. Owen's face lost color in a visible rush. I have the formation records, I said, and the bank confirmation letter. Martin whispered, Jesus, before he could stop himself. Third, I went on, taking a slow sip of water. The access logs for my restricted strategy folder show repeated after-hours entries from Sloane Whitaker's credentials and one service account tied to executive operations. Those logs begin on March 14th, the same date I wrote on the board. Sloane straightened, so abruptly her chair wheels rolled back an inch. My credentials are shared across teams, all the time. That means nothing. Actually, I said, setting down the glass, they weren't shared that night. Your badge opened the 12th floor east entrance at 10:53 p.m. Then your laptop authenticated to the internal server from conference room 12C at 11:01. Camera footage confirms you were carrying my printed deck when you left. The room went very still again. Not stunned this time. Calculating. Gerald finally spoke. How exactly did you obtain camera footage? Through proper preservation channels, I said. That answer landed differently. Malcolm looked at me sharply. Helen sat back. Priya, for the first time all morning, let herself breathe. What channels? Sloane demanded. I slid a single envelope from my briefcase onto the walnut. Heavy cream paper. Not company stationery. Outside counsel, I said. Her mouth parted. Gerald's hand flattened on the table. You involved lawyers, he said softly. 2 weeks ago. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Rain tracked down the glass in thin silver lines. Owen's foot started bouncing under the table with frantic little taps that shook the lower edge of his chair. You had no right, Sloane snapped. You're an employee. I was an employee, I corrected. As of the moment you fabricated evidence in front of the board, I became a witness. Malcolm set the iPad down with care. Gerald, he said, and his voice had lost all warmth. I need a private word. No, I said. All heads turned to me. No more private words. Not today. I folded my hands loosely in front of me. You brought this into the room, publicly. We can finish the first part publicly. Sloane was breathing harder now. Tiny movements. A twitch at the corner of the mouth. One hand pressing at her collarbone as if the room had warmed. You self-righteous little. Stop, Gerald said. She stopped. Not because she respected him. Because fear had finally outrank performance. I reached into my briefcase again and removed 3 documents bound with black clips. One for each independent board member, I said. Timeline summary. Forensic notes. Preservation notice. You'll find a 4th appendix documenting duplicate vendor spend routed through entities tied to Owen. Owen pushed back from the table. I'm not sitting here for this. Sit down, Gerald said. Owen looked at him, stunned, and slowly sat. I handed the packets to Helen, Martin, and Priya because Priya had just been added to the special session that morning as window dressing and everyone in the room knew it. Her fingers brushed mine for half a second. Cold. What do you want? Helen asked. There it was. The real question. Not am I guilty. Not what happened. What will make this survivable? I met her gaze. I want this meeting adjourned. I want no devices wiped, no accounts touched, no one contacted outside this room except through counsel. And I want a formal session at Rutherford and Vale by 4 p.m. tomorrow with independent board representation present. Sloane gave a disbelieving stare. You think you're dictating terms? I looked at her. Really looked. Mascara perfect. Lipstick exact. Pulse fluttering fast at the base of her throat. No, I said quietly. I think I'm describing your remaining options. Malcolm stood. He's right. That hit harder than anything I'd said. Gerald's face changed then. Not publicly. Not enough for most people to catch. But I saw it. The first clean break in the man's certainty. He had built a career on deciding which reality the room would accept. And for the first time in a very long time, the room had chosen someone else's. I packed my marker, my clicker, and my water bottle with the same care I'd brought them in. Sloane watched every movement as if calm itself had become an insult. At the door I paused and turned back. "Oh," I said. "One more thing. My presentation deck was good. You should have let me finish it." Then I walked out. Behind me, chairs scraped. Voices overlapped. Malcolm was already issuing instructions. Gerald's baritone cut once through the noise and disappeared. Sloane said my name in a tone that wanted to sound venomous and landed somewhere closer to frightened. They thought they had ended my future in one meeting. They had no idea I'd spent weeks building the room where theirs would end instead. The next day, Manhattan looked scrubbed raw by rain. By 3:30, the stone facade of Rutherford and Vale on Madison Avenue gleamed under a pale spring sky, all brass fixtures and black-framed windows. Inside, the reception area smelled like polished oak and paper that had been expensive before it was printed on. Quiet lived there differently. Not like fear. Like authority. I arrived 10 minutes early. Navy suit. White shirt. No tie. My briefcase felt lighter than it had any right to. Dana Mercer was already waiting near the conference suite, flipping through a binder thick with tabs. Dana was senior litigation counsel, early 40s, silver-threaded dark hair cut just below the jaw, and a stillness so complete it made everyone around her feel louder. She had the kind of face juries trust and executives underestimate until it's too late. "You slept," she said without looking up. "Enough. Good. They didn't." I almost smiled. "How do you know?" She closed the binder. "Because Gerald Whitaker's outside counsel called at 6:15 this morning, then again at 7, then tried a back channel through a retired judge I play tennis with. Panic leaves a schedule." We walked into conference room B, long mahogany table. Cream walls. Brass sconces. Water carafes sweating onto coasters. The leather chairs were darker than the table, burnished from use. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked west over cabs and scaffolding and the softened geometry of late afternoon light. Power rooms always pretend to be neutral. They never are. They're theaters built to make people agree under pressure. Dana had arranged my files in measured stacks. Timeline binders. Vendor records. Metadata reports. Printed stills from security footage. An index of audio transcriptions. A sealed envelope labeled for board review only. On the side credenza sat a silver tray with coffee, tea, and shortbread nobody would touch. "They'll come in waves," Dana said. Gerald first, to reassert center. Sloane second, because she can't bear an entrance that feels secondary. Owen last, because he'll hope his delay changes the weather. She was right. Gerald came in at 3:52 with his personal attorney, Charles Wexler, both men wearing the same expression powerful people wear when they need to look insulted rather than afraid. Gerald's suit was charcoal today. Tie burgundy. He moved slower than usual, like a man practicing steadiness. His eyes landed on me, then Dana, then the binders. One beat too long. Sloane arrived 3 minutes later with a woman in a bone-colored suit and a mouth set in a line so hard it seemed carved there. Sloane had traded silk for armor, dark sheath dress, black blazer, hair pinned back severe enough to show the strain around her temples. She dropped into her chair without greeting anyone and immediately uncapped a pen she never used. Owen appeared at 4:01, cheeks sallow, jaw shadowed, no lawyer beside him for the first 10 seconds because his had gotten stuck signing in downstairs. That told me everything about the day he'd had. He kept touching his cuff as if he'd forgotten how sleeves worked. The independent directors, joined by video on a screen mounted into the far wall, Helen from her townhouse library, Martin from a private office downtown, and Arthur Lynn, who had stayed silent at the ambush because silence was his preferred investment style. Malcolm was there in person, but he sat slightly back from Gerald now. Fractional distance. In rooms like that, fractions matter. Dana waited until everyone was seated. Then she opened the first binder. "Thank you for attending," she said. "Not warm, not cold, just exact. We are here to address evidence of document theft, fabrication of evidence, retaliatory defamation, misuse of corporate assets, breach of fiduciary duty, and potential securities-related misrepresentations at Whitaker Consumer Group. Sloane snorted softly. That's theatrical. Dana didn't even glance at her. Exhibit 1. She slid a document toward the camera and the people at the table. Server authentication logs, highlighted in pale yellow. These records show unauthorized access to Mr. Avery's restricted strategic planning folder beginning March 14th at 23:01 and continuing across 9 separate dates. Access credentials belong to Ms. Whitaker and a service account under Executive Operations Oversight. Sloane leaned forward. Credentials can be misused. Which is why, Dana continued, we obtained corresponding badge records, camera stills, and geolocation pings from the company-issued device assigned to Ms. Whitaker. Sloane's lawyer placed a hand lightly over her client's wrist. First restraint of the afternoon. Dana moved to Exhibit 2. These are version history comparisons between Mr. Avery's original retail turnaround presentation and the modified deck later circulated internally under Mr. Pike's team. Metadata confirms export on March 19th from a terminal assigned to executive staff. You'll note the intentional variance marker on slide 13. Gerald's attorney adjusted his glasses. Intentional variance marker. A forensic watermark, Dana said. A false but immaterial numerical deviation inserted after Mr. Avery became aware his materials were being copied without authorization. It appears in the fabricated external deck presented yesterday as supposed proof of leakage. That can only occur if the source file used in the fabrication came from the stolen internal version. Martin's face on the screen tightened. Helen sat utterly still. Arthur Lynn took off his glasses and cleaned them with slow disbelief. Owen cleared his throat. I never fabricated anything. Dana turned one page. Exhibit 3. A formation record. Pike Advisory Ventures, LLC. The paper itself was ordinary. The effect was not. This entity, Dana said, was formed 17 months ago and shares a registered agent address with 2 vendors that received a combined $4.6 million in Whitaker funds under innovation and brand activation line items. The approval chain for those disbursements includes Mr. Pike on every occasion. Owen's lawyer had finally arrived and was whispering urgently in his ear. Owen's lips moved once. I didn't know. Nobody believed it. Not even him. Dana continued, methodical, unhurried, each page placed down with 2 fingertips, each point built not for drama but for inevitability. She laid out the billing irregularities first, then the communications, then the timeline. That timeline was where the room fractured. March 14th, unauthorized access to my strategic folder. March 19th, internal redistribution of altered materials. March 24th, Owen presents selected language from my deck in an executive innovation review. April 2nd, Sloane requests clean copies without author footer. April 9th, Gerald receives summary briefing on the turnaround proposal with my name removed from cover materials. April 15th, Redwood shell domain registered. April 16th, fabricated email account activated. April 22nd, false payment spreadsheet created using values derived from Pike-linked entities. April 29th, board pitch scheduled. False accusation prepared for public interruption. Dana didn't embellish. She didn't need to. Premeditation looks worse when it's boring. A scheme written as calendar entries lands like cold iron. Then she opened the sealed envelope. This next portion addresses motive and internal coordination, she said. It also explains why Mr. Avery chose preservation before confrontation. Gerald finally spoke. Dana, before you proceed, I think it would be wise. No, Malcolm said. Everyone looked at him. He had his hands folded on the table now, but not in Gerald's style. Not performative. Protective. Of himself. No more internal containment, Malcolm said. We're past that. Gerald's gaze sharpened. Be careful. Malcolm held it. I am. Dana withdrew several printed transcripts and placed one before each person. 3 weeks ago, an individual approached Mr. Avery through counsel with corroborating information. We vetted that individual, preserved the source materials, and confirmed authenticity through metadata and independent cross-reference. Sloane's pen stopped moving. Dana looked to the far end of the room. Miss Torres, would you come in? The door opened. Camila stepped inside wearing a charcoal dress and low black heels, a slim folder tucked to her side. No trembling. No dramatics. Just quiet resolve. Sloane's face changed so fast it was almost ugly. "You," she said. Camila took the empty chair nearest Dana. "Yes." Owen stared at her like he'd found a knife in his own kitchen drawer. Sloane laughed under her breath. "You were my assistant." "No," Camila said. "I manage your calendar." "There's a difference." That sentence moved through the room like a draft. Dana nodded toward her. Miss Torres preserved meeting notes, voice memos, and scheduling records indicating coordination between Ms. Whitaker and Mr. Pike regarding appropriation of Mr. Avery's work product and an effort to discredit him if he objected. Charles Wexler straightened. On what basis was she recording anything? Camila answered before Dana could. On the basis that your client once asked me to schedule a dinner with an investor under his wife's name and told me to make it disappear if anyone noticed. Gerald's eyes went flat. Dana slid forward the transcript of a voice memo. Gerald's voice, muffled but identifiable. "If Noah gets possessive about ownership, Sloane handles it. Owen needs the win. The board doesn't care where ideas come from as long as the room feels stable." No one moved. Then another transcript. Sloane's voice, clearer, colder. "He's naive. We give him enough visibility to keep him working. Then we slot Owen into the final narrative. If he complains, we call it breach behavior." Another. Owen, lower and nervous. "What if he has copies?" Sloane again. "Then we make the copies look like the crime." Arthur Lynn closed his eyes. Just for a second. Helen muttered something I couldn't hear, but it looked like a prayer or a curse. Sloane turned to Camila, color draining from her face in waves. "You stole private company records." "I preserved evidence of misconduct," Camila said. "After you asked me to move Mr. Avery's pitch so your father would be present for the interruption. I trusted you." Camila's expression didn't change. "That was your mistake." There it was. The unexpected ally. The person they believed invisible. The person who knew where timing lived. Sloane's lawyer whispered, "Stop speaking." Sloane ignored her. "Why?" she said to Camila. "Why would you do this for him?" Camila's answer was simple. "Because he said thank you when you said my name like a command. Because he was the only person in 6 years who asked whether I wanted to be in the room rather than assuming I belonged outside it. And because when people like you think no one is watching, you get sloppy." She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't need to. Dana let that settle. Then she brought out the next piece. "There is also," she said, "the matter of Ms. Whitaker's communications with outside analysts regarding a pending financing narrative inconsistent with internal performance data. If pursued, that may create significant regulatory exposure." That was when Gerald lost the room. He pushed his chair back a few inches and turned to Wexler. "We are not discussing financing strategy in this forum." Dana folded her hands. "You already are." Gerald ignored her and looked at Malcolm. "This is a personnel dispute inflated by disloyal employees and an opportunistic attorney." "Disloyal," Malcolm repeated softly. Gerald swung toward him. "You know exactly what I mean." Malcolm opened his own folder. "I know precisely what you mean. I also know I advised against placing Owen on the April communications chain. I advised against reclassifying the innovation spend. And I advised, in writing, against any retaliatory action tied to Noah's work product." He slid copies across the table. Gerald stared. "You copied those memos." "I preserve them." A beat later, Martin spoke from the screen. "Gerald, did you know about the vendor entities?" Wexler jumped in. "I advised my client not to answer that." Arthur Lynn leaned toward his camera. "That is an answer." Owen's composure finally split. "This is insane," he blurted. "I was told it was covered. I was told legal had signed off." Gerald said. Gerald's head snapped toward him. "Be very careful, Owen." "No." Owen shot back, voice cracking. "You told me it was normal. You said everybody repackages internal work. You said Noah was temporary." Sloane rounded on him. "You weak little coward." He pointed at her with a trembling hand. "You forged the email. You used your shell company. You told me to. I told you to stop being useless for 1 quarter." Their lawyers were speaking over them now. Dana was not. Dana simply took notes while the two of them tore open the last seams of their alliance. It was almost disappointing how ordinary it looked. Not operatic. Not cinematic. Just frightened, Rich people discovering loyalty was a costume they could no longer afford. I sat still and watched. There is a peculiar peace that arrives when the truth no longer requires your labor. You don't need to convince. You don't need to plead. You just need to remain seated while other people trip over the structure they built to cage you. It was like watching glass crack under clear water. Quiet at first, then everywhere. Helen Brock was the first board member to speak with full authority. "We need an executive leave action immediately," she said. "Gerald, Sloan, and Owen pending independent review." Gerald gave a laugh, so controlled it sounded dangerous. "You think you can suspend the founder?" "I think," Helen replied, "the founder should have remembered he still answers to a board." Arthur nodded. Martin nodded. Malcolm didn't speak, but he didn't have to. Wexler adjusted, tried a new angle. "Let's all be practical. Litigation serves no one. Reputational harm here could be significant across all parties. Perhaps a confidential separation and settlement." Dana cut in. "Mr. Avery is willing to discuss civil resolution. However, that discussion begins with full acknowledgement of theft, falsification, retaliatory conduct, and compensation tied to the quantifiable value of the strategic plan and career damage inflicted." Sloan laughed again, but now it sounded brittle. "Career damage? Please." He was lucky to be in the room at all. I spoke for the first time in several minutes. "That's the part that fascinates me," I said. "You still think access was the gift?" She stared at me. I leaned forward slightly. "You thought being near power made you power. It doesn't. It just makes your mistakes easier to document." Gerald's fingers tapped once on the table, then stopped. "What do you want, Noah? Not what will make this go away. Not what can we survive. What do you want?" Control translated into negotiation. Dana slid a single sheet toward him. There were 5 terms. Immediate administrative leave for Gerald Whitaker, Sloan Whitaker, and Owen Pike. Independent forensic audit supervised by counsel selected by the independent directors. Formal written acknowledgement of my authorship of the retail turnaround strategy and public internal correction to the executive leadership team. A separation package including accelerated equity equivalent, damages, and a consulting option at my sole discretion. Board vote to consider adoption of the strategy under new interim oversight with implementation leadership offered to me on independent contractual terms or bought out at a premium. Gerald scanned it once. "Extortion. Consequences," Dana said. Sloan pushed back from the table, so hard her chair legs squealed. "Do not sign anything. This is bluffing. He doesn't want court. He doesn't want headlines." I met her eyes. "You're right about one thing. I didn't want headlines. I let a beat pass. That's why I gave you the chance to keep this in a room." Dana opened another binder tab. "One final point before you decide," she said. "There is a draft package prepared for regulators and a separate package prepared for financial press should preservation obligations be breached." Charles Wexler went pale. Gerald's voice lowered. "You set that up." "I made sure," I said, "you'd find exactly what I wanted you to find." The line hung there. Sharp. Clean. Sloane's pen finally snapped in her hand. Ink marked the side of her thumb in a crooked blue stain. She looked at it with detached disbelief, as if her body had betrayed her in public. Owen was sweating now, visibly. His color darkened. He turned to Gerald in something very close to panic. "Say something." Gerald did, but not to help him. "To counsel only," Gerald said. That was when his empire ended, even if only 3 people in the room knew it in that moment. Because once a man starts speaking only to counsel, he has stopped leading and started surviving. The negotiation ran another 92 minutes. It moved through threat, denial, posture, retreat, and then the slow administrative language that follows collapse. Wording was fought over. Effective dates, scope of admission, structure of payment, interim communications, litigation standstill contingent on compliance. Dana handled it all with the patient precision of a surgeon, cutting dead tissue away from living nerve. At one point Sloane hissed, "You planned this?" I looked at her across the mahogany and said, "No. You planned it. I just finished it." Later, when Owen tried one last pathetic turn toward camaraderie, saying, "Noah, come on, we can fix this privately," I answered, "Next time, make sure they're not working for both sides." His lawyer closed his eyes. Camila remained through the key sections, then left before signatures. She had no interest in the theater of surrender, only the fact of it. At 6:41 p.m., under brass lights beginning to glow warmer as the city outside darkened into blue, Gerald Whittaker signed first. His hand was steady, which I'll give him. Men like that hold on to ceremony, even when substance is gone. Sloane signed last after arguing over one sentence for 11 full minutes. When she finally pressed pen to paper, her jaw was locked so hard a muscle jumped at the hinge. She did not look at me. She looked at the signature line, as if it had personally betrayed her. Owen's signature was nearly illegible. Helen requested the final pages be scanned immediately. Arthur asked for the interim leadership resolution by morning. Martin said, "I want the audit to start tonight." Malcolm sat with his face turned slightly away from Gerald, as if proximity had become professionally indecent. When it was over, Dana gathered the signed documents into a slim black portfolio and nodded once. "That concludes the session." Chairs moved. Lawyers rose. Papers slid into cases. The room regained its ordinary sounds. Fabric against leather. Glass touched by fingertips. The banal acoustics of consequence. Gerald stood near the door as people filtered out. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked old in a way money couldn't hide. Not weak, just suddenly measurable. He watched me approach with that founder's expression still trying to reassemble itself into inevitability. "You could have brought concerns to me," he said quietly. I stopped beside him. "I did," I said. "You called them noise." Sloane was a few steps beyond him in the corridor, waiting for the elevator with her lawyer. She heard that. Her shoulders stiffened. The elevator chimed. Warm brass doors opened. Gerald didn't move, so I gave him the line he'd earned. "You were right about timing," I said. "At this level, everything is." Then I left him there under the law firm's muted lights, surrounded by polished wood, signed pages, and the precise silence that follows people who finally understand no one is coming to rescue them. The next few days were controlled chaos. Whittaker Consumer Group announced temporary leadership restructuring through an internal memo so sanitized it bordered on comedy. Gerald was taking a leave of absence for health and governance review. Sloane was stepping back from active duties during a strategic compliance assessment. Owen's name disappeared from the executive page by Friday afternoon with no explanation at all, which somehow felt harsher. My own correction memo went out 12 hours later. It acknowledged that the retail turnaround framework presented for board consideration had been developed by me, and that prior attributions had been inaccurate. Corporate language always tries to vacuum the blood off a knife. Still, the point landed. My inbox flooded. Some messages were sincere. Priya wrote, "You handled that with more grace than anyone there deserved." Malcolm sent a short note that simply said, "You were right to preserve." Helen requested a private call to discuss whether I would consider implementing the plan under interim oversight. Martin asked if I'd consult during the audit. Arthur wanted to know if the margin recovery targets were still viable if the vanity spend was cut immediately. Other messages were more revealing. At 1:14 a.m. on the second night, Sloane texted from an unrecognized number, "You embarrassed my family." I archived it. At 2:03 a.m., "This isn't over." Archived. At 2:19 a.m., "You think you won because you got lucky." Archived. Then, 3 days later, a message in a completely different tone. "I missed the version of this where you were reasonable." Archived. Owen called twice, left one voicemail, and sounded like a man trying to perform remorse while bargaining with reality. "Noah, hey listen, I know things got out of hand. I just want to explain my side. There were pressures you didn't see. If you just call me back, I think we can clear up some assumptions." Archived. Gerald didn't call at all. Men like him don't reach for the person who beat them until every other route is closed. The audit moved quickly. Once independent investigators enter the books, more things started falling out. Not all of them were mine to chase, and that was the beauty of it. Truth, once oxygenated, gets ambitious. The Pike-linked vendor arrangement turned out to be only one layer. There were inflated event contracts, shadow advisory retainers, and a private travel habit routed through market visits that had apparently taught several executives a great deal about Napa wine country and very little about operations. 6 weeks later, the board made the leave permanent. Gerald Whittaker resigned with a statement about legacy, stewardship, and confidence in the company's future. Nobody inside the company used the word legacy again without a trace of irony. He disappeared into that special kind of rich man exile where nobody is ruined exactly, but everyone knows the invitations have changed. The charity dinners came less often. The speaking requests dried up. A profile that had once called him the disciplined architect of modern consumer resilience quietly edited its language to former chief executive. That had to sting more than any headline. Sloane lost more than the title she thought was her birthright. She lost the room. In corporate dynasties, reputation is currency, and hers devalued overnight. People still took her calls at first, but with the cautious, clipped tone reserved for contamination. 2 boutique funds declined her. A lifestyle brand she was rumored to be joining suddenly announced a leadership restructuring of its own. Someone forwarded me a photo from a panel at the Mercer Hotel 3 months later where she'd arrived in white and left early, sitting rigid in the back like a guest at someone else's wedding. The irony was almost too neat. She had spent years treating other people like temporary furniture in her father's empire. Then the empire blinked, and she discovered furniture gets replaced faster than blood. Owen, predictably, fared worst in ways that mattered most to him. His professional diminishment was immediate and public enough to be painful. Once the shell entities came into the audit trail, no serious company would touch him above a decorative advisory role, and even those vanished after the second wave of reporting. His LinkedIn title changed 3 times in 5 months, each version smaller than the last. Executive advisor, brand consultant, independent operator, the language of a slow professional evaporation. Priya told me he was trying to pitch himself as a misunderstood growth strategist in Miami. That felt right. Some men spend their whole lives fleeing the scene of the version of themselves everybody finally met. As for the enablers, consequences arrived with less drama and more accuracy. Wexler's firm dropped Gerald as a marquee client. 2 internal finance managers who had signed off on sloppy reallocations found themselves answering very specific questions from very humorless auditors. One investor relations director who had nodded along for years suddenly announced an early retirement to spend time with family, which is corporate for I'd rather jump than be pushed. Nobody went to prison. Real life rarely distributes justice with that kind of symmetry. But the social and professional cost was surgical. Enough to be remembered. Enough to alter the way each of them would walk into rooms for the rest of their lives. I did not go back inside Whitaker as an employee. That surprised some people. It disappointed others. Helen, to her credit, understood immediately. "You don't know the building your repair work," she told me over coffee at a quiet place on Madison with green marble tables and brass lamps that made everyone look wiser than they were. "But if you want the contract, the board wants you leading the turnaround externally." So I took the consulting agreement on my terms. Independent, time-boxed, premium fee, full authorship protection, direct board access, no reporting through any family line because there was no family line left to report through. In the process of building my own protective case, I had discovered something I hadn't expected. I was good at this part too. Not just strategy, not just market recovery, but structural clarity under pressure, mapping lies to incentives, finding where organizations rot and where they can still heal. Companies started calling after the Whitaker matter stayed private, but not invisible. Not everyone knew the story in full. Enough new pieces. Enough knew I had walked through a governance fire and come out carrying the blueprint. By autumn, I had founded Avery Resolution Partners out of a sunlit office in Flatiron with exposed brick walls, black steel shelving, and windows that caught the late afternoon light in long amber bands across the floor. We specialized in turnaround strategy, internal controls, and executive risk triage. That was the formal version. The honest version was simpler. I helped companies tell the truth early enough to avoid the kind of rooms I just survived. The first morning I unlocked that office, the city looked freshly made. Cold blue sky, clean glass, steam rising from street grates and white ribbons. I set a ceramic mug on the windowsill, poured coffee dark enough to smell like toasted earth, and stood there in shirt sleeves watching people hurry below with coats half-buttoned and phones to their ears. There is a kind of wealth that has nothing to do with money. Light on your own floor. Silence you chose. Work that belongs to your name before it belongs to anyone else. I had never understood that fully until then. Camila joined me 2 months later as chief of staff. That was not charity. It was the easiest executive decision I made all year. She came into the new office on her first day, carrying a slim laptop bag and a plant she said was hard to kill, which seemed on brand. She wore navy trousers, a cream blouse, and the same unreadable calm that had once carried an empire's calendar on its back. Within a week, she had reorganized my schedule, renegotiated a vendor contract I hadn't realized was ridiculous, and created a color-coded intake system so efficient one client asked if we had hired a military planner. She scares me a little, my operations lead whispered once. She should, I said. Camila heard that and, without looking up from her screen, said, correct. Not everyone from Whitaker vanished from my life. Priya didn't. She left 6 weeks after Gerald's resignation, citing creative differences and chronic exhaustion, which was one of the truest euphemisms I'd ever heard. We started having dinner every few weeks at a narrow little place in Gramercy where the tables were walnut, the wine list was too confident, and the candlelight made everyone's seams softened at the edges. She had survived by reading rooms. I had survived by refusing to be defined by them. It turned out those skills translated well into friendship. One Thursday evening, maybe 4 months after the Rutherford and Vale session, she showed up wrapped in a charcoal coat with wind in her hair and sat across from me with a grin already forming. You won't believe who I just saw, she said. I lifted my glass. Dangerous opening line. Sloan. I waited. At an investor breakfast in Tribeca. Not presenting. Not hosting. Assisting. I let out a slow breath through my nose. No. Priya nodded, delighted. Holding a tablet. Checking names. Doing the smile. I thought about that for a moment. The precision of the universe isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just proportional. How did she look? Priya took a sip of red wine. Like someone discovering that being adjacent to power and being power are not interchangeable. We clinked glasses and moved on. That was the other surprise. Once the main wound scarred over, I found I didn't need to keep touching it. I didn't need updates to feel alive. I didn't need their pain to validate mine. The karmic catalog was satisfying, yes, but the deeper pleasure came from indifference arriving naturally instead of being forced. Their names stopped having temperature. That didn't stop the messages. 3 months in, Gerald finally called. I was in the office late, city lights reflected in the black window glass, when his name appeared on my screen. I let it ring through to voicemail. His voice sounded older than I remembered. Noah, I think enough time has passed for adults to speak plainly. I'd like to discuss a private matter. You understand discretion. I believe there may be an opportunity for mutual benefit if we can put emotion aside. Emotion. That was his word for consequence. Archived. A week later, a handwritten card arrived on thick cream stock, no return address but unmistakably chosen by someone who had once believed stationery could repair character. The family isn't the same. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Only perspective. No signature, though it was obviously Gerald. I placed it in a gray archival box with the others and closed the lid. Camila found me doing that and raised one eyebrow. Threat or nostalgia? Both, in a tailored envelope. She nodded. On brand. She was right. All of them cycled through the same stages. First pressure, then denial, then revision, then longing for a version of the past that had only ever existed because other people tolerated their behavior. They wanted absolution without humility, access without accountability, memory without facts. I answered them all the same way, by not answering at all. 6 months after the boardroom, Whitaker Consumer Group had stabilized under interim leadership and adopted enough of my turnaround framework to stop the operational bleed. I kept my engagement narrow and finite. Store rationalization, vendor cleanup, margin discipline, governance reporting. Then I walked away with the work completed and the final payment wired on time. The last time I went into the Whitaker headquarters, the lobby looked exactly as it had on my first day. Same stone floor, same brushed steel reception desk, same arrangement of sculptural branches in a black ceramic vase. But the energy was different, lighter somehow, less ceremonial, more honest. The building had lost its monarchy and become a company again. On my way out, a junior analyst I barely knew hurried from the elevators and said, "Mr. Avery, I just wanted to say the deck you built saved my entire division." I smiled. "Then make sure the next one has your name on it." He nodded with the serious expression of someone being handed a principle rather than advice. That evening I went home to an apartment I had moved into 2 months earlier on the edge of Brooklyn Heights. Nothing extravagant. Just clean lines, warm wood floors, a balcony facing west, and enough quiet to hear myself think. At sunrise, the kitchen, filled with pale gold light that slid over the stone countertop and made steam from the kettle look almost delicate. I developed habits there. Grind coffee beans while the city was still soft. Open the balcony door even in cool weather. Stand barefoot on the wood and let the morning settle into me before the phone started ringing. Fresh starts are rarely dramatic when they're real. They're domestic, repetitive, built out of tiny proofs that your life is yours again. One Sunday, Camila came by with bakery croissants in a white paper bag that left faint butter marks on the counter. She walked straight to the balcony, looked out at the water flashing silver beyond the rooftops, and said, "You know, if you told me a year ago that I'd quit a dynastic circus to help build a firm with a man who color codes risk matrices for fun, I would have been concerned." "You are concerned," I said. "Deeply. But the coffee helps." We stood there in the morning light, leaning against the railing, watching ferries move across the river like slow white strokes of paint. "You ever regret it?" I asked. "How you left?" She considered. "No. I regret how long I stayed." That sentence sat with me all day. Because that was the real wound beneath everything, wasn't it? Not simply what they did, but how long we train ourselves to endure environments that ask us to shrink in exchange for access. How often competence gets sold back to us as privilege. How many people spend years mistaking tolerance for strategy. I didn't make that mistake anymore. Winter came, then softened. Then one April evening, almost a year to the week from the ambush, Priya invited me to a rooftop gathering in Soho for the launch of a sustainable design venture she had joined as founding creative director. I almost said no. Then I said yes because healing, if you're lucky, eventually starts sounding like curiosity. The rooftop had terracotta planters, string lights, and long teak tables glowing under the orange wash of sunset. The city beyond them shimmered into evening, windows kindling one by one as the sky deepened from gold to rose to blue. Glasses chimed softly, linen jackets folded over chair backs. Somewhere near the bar, someone laughed with that loose, unguarded sound that only comes when nobody in the room is performing power too hard. And there, near a cluster of olive trees and brushed cement planters, was Lena Hart. If you'd asked me a year earlier who Lena was, I would have called her one of Sloane's social satellites. The glamorous one people whispered about because she had appeared at Whitaker-adjacent dinners too often, knew Owen far too well, and always seemed to understand more than she said. "Noah," she said, "I think you two deserve an evening where the only thing being exchanged is decent wine." Lena laughed. That would be a nice change. There was no awkwardness. Maybe because we had all aged a little in ways that had nothing to do with time. Maybe because catastrophe burns off false social geometry faster than politeness ever can. We talked, not about Whitaker first, about neighborhoods, about work, about how terrible most launch party playlists are, about the fact that Priya still ordered for the table like a woman who didn't trust menus to make good choices on their own. Eventually the past arrived, but lightly. "I hated that room," Lena said at one point, looking out over the city. "All those dinners, all that polished cruelty. You could feel people editing themselves in real time." I nodded. I used to think that was sophistication. And now I think clarity is more expensive. She smiled at that. As the sun lowered, the whole rooftop turned amber. Faces warmed. Glass edges flashed. The city looked almost merciful from that height, all sharp corners softened by distance and light. Priya disappeared briefly and returned with 3 fresh drinks. She handed one to me, one to Lena, kept one for herself, and lifted hers. "To exits," she said. Lena raised an eyebrow. "Only exits," Priya considered. "To better entrances." We laughed, and our glasses touched with a clean, bright note. I looked around that rooftop then. At Priya, who had rebuilt her career in a place that valued her eye instead of harvesting it. At Lena, who had stepped away from proximity and discovered she preferred substance. At the skyline catching fire in the last stretch of daylight. At my own hands, steady around the glass. There had been a time when I would have measured myself by whether rooms like Whitaker's would let me stay. Whether men like Gerald would praise my thinking. Whether women like Sloane would stop testing the edges of my dignity. I thought advancement meant acceptance. I thought being calm meant being compliant. I thought if I worked hard enough, made myself useful enough, precise enough, indispensable enough, merit would protect me. It doesn't. Not by itself. What protects you is seeing clearly, documenting early, speaking carefully, leaving when the architecture requires your silence more than your skill. The person I was before all this wasn't weak, just untested in the right way, too willing to confuse invitation with respect, too ready to believe professionalism would be reciprocated simply because I offered it. I don't judge that version of me. He built the version standing here. But I don't miss him either. That's the strange grace of betrayal when it fails to break you. It teaches contour. It clarifies appetite. It strips away the need to be chosen by people who only value what they can control. And if I'm honest in the quietest part of myself, I am grateful to them for that. Not for the humiliation, not for the lies, but for the pressure that revealed exactly what in me would not bend. The sky darkened. First stars invisible in the city glow. Windows lit across the avenues in grids of white and gold. A soft breeze moved through the rooftop trees and carried the scent of citrus peel, warm stone, and evening air cooling over brick. Lena leaned her elbows on the railing and said, almost to herself, "Funny. I used to think revenge would look louder." I took a slow sip and watched the light settle over the city. "It usually does from far away," I said. "Up close, it looks like peace." Priya glanced at me over the rim of her glass. "That's annoyingly good. It's also true." We stood there for another minute without speaking, the kind of silence that feels earned instead of empty. Then I lifted my glass once more, not high, just enough. To the company that tried to erase me. To the daughter who thought interruption was power. To the father who called truth noise. To the man who mistook borrowed language for leadership. I thanked them quietly, inwardly, with no bitterness left in it. They had handed me the hardest lesson of my professional life in the ugliest packaging possible. And in doing so, they had forced me to become someone who no longer needed their permission to rise. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about making people suffer. It's about becoming untouchable by the version of you they thought they owned. And maybe that's the lesson I carry now whenever the sun drops orange behind the skyline and the city lights come on one by one beneath me. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying their world. It's about building yours, so while their shadows can't reach it anymore,